Welcome back. The last video ended with a look at Clock Tower, a Super Nintendo horror game published by Human Entertainment in 1995. And that same company, Human Entertainment, would soon publish two more noteworthy horror-themed video games, namely the first two games of a series called Twilight Syndrome, which translates to Twilight Syndrome. The first game is called Twilight Syndrome Tansaku-hen, with Tansaku carrying meanings like search or exploration, and hen basically meaning something like volume or story arc here. So you could translate this title as Twilight Syndrome Exploration Arc, although some English websites I found simply list this title as Twilight Syndrome Search. It was released in March 1996 for the PlayStation and was actually just the first half of what had originally been supposed to be one whole game, while the other half was released separately in July 1996 as Twilight Syndrome Kyūmei-hen. This could be translated as Twilight Syndrome Investigation Arc. But why had they split it into two releases? To understand what exactly happened here, we need to take a closer look at the development history of this game. And what better way to do that than to check out what someone directly involved with the project had to say about it? Because I actually found an interview with the director of Twilight Syndrome, or rather with the one who would eventually become the director of Twilight Syndrome, but we'll come to that in a minute. This person was none other than Suda Goichi, also known under his nickname Suda51, who is perhaps best known for his games The Silver Case from 1999, Killer 7 from 2005, or No More Heroes from 2007. Now, when the development of Twilight Syndrome began, Suda wasn't even involved in it, but at some point during its development, Suda was suddenly approached by a section manager who told him that the whole Twilight Syndrome project was not going well at all. Apparently, it wasn't going anywhere, and as a last resort, Suda was then asked if he couldn't do something about it. In the interview, Suda explains that he wasn't exactly fond of the idea of touching someone else's work. What's more, Suda had actually been planning to create his own original project, but nothing he came up with got approval. His reluctance to take over someone else's project is even more understandable against that background. But in the end, Suda talked to the Twilight Syndrome director at the time, who then personally begged Suda to take over, to which Suda finally agreed, but only under the condition that Suda could do as he pleased without any interference from the former director. And this is how Suda Goichi became the new director of Twilight Syndrome. Well, it turned out that although the game was supposed to contain 10 chapters, only about 3 of them were actually done, with just 3 more months left to finish the project. To somehow salvage this situation, Suda eventually came up with the idea of splitting the game into 2 parts, allowing them to finish the first 5 chapters in these remaining 3 months and to release the other half a few months later. And thus, Twilight Syndrome, originally intended as one game with 10 chapters, turned into Twilight Syndrome Tansaku-hen, or Exploration Arc, released in March 1996, and Twilight Syndrome Kyūmei-hen, or Investigation Arc, released in July 1996, each game containing 5 chapters, plus some shorter additional chapters like prologue, epilogue, and such. As for the style and contents of these games, in the interview I found, the interviewer at one point asks if the Twilight Syndrome games were perhaps born from the idea to create another game like Clock Tower, and it's not difficult to see why someone would get the idea, because there are a few noteworthy similarities. First of all, similar to Clock Tower, Twilight Syndrome also makes use of characters that were created after filming real actors. Furthermore, Twilight Syndrome also features a mainly female cast, a health system that shows how panicked or fatigued the characters are. To the right, you can see both the health indicator from the first and the second Twilight Syndrome game, and gameplay with a mostly side-scrolling perspective. However, in the interview, Suda actually explains that creating another game like Clock Tower wasn't the original intention. Rather, the game was born from the idea to take the advanced 3D sound that Human Entertainment had developed back then and try and use it for a horror game. Still, even if the original intention was not to recreate Clock Tower's experience, the aforementioned examples show that you can certainly find some elements in Twilight Syndrome that were quite possibly inspired by it. But, just as there are some noteworthy similarities, there also are some striking differences between these two games, especially when it comes to the setting and the plot. Clock Tower dealt, amongst other things, with a murderous and deformed stalker child in a Norwegian mansion deep in the woods, which is a pretty un-Japanese setting, owed to the fact that Clock Tower's director Kono Hifumi wanted to create a game similar to the horror films of Italian director Dario Argento. Twilight Syndrome, on the other hand, is a very Japanese experience. It's a game that feels like it was inspired by pretty much everything occult and paranormal from Japanese media and pop culture from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Here are a few examples from the first two games. In Chapter 1, one of the main characters, called Mika, claims to know someone who is acquainted with a certain Kibo Aiko. This is most likely a reference to Gibo Aiko, a Japanese psychic who was quite famous and active on Japanese TV during the 80s and 90s. Another example, in Chapter 6, Mika mentions a trend called Zensei de wa Senshi, which could be translated as, "In my past life, I was a warrior." She goes on to say that she doesn't want to be part of anything like that, even calling it weird and creepy. And this is actually a reference to the following occurrence. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a manga called Boku no Chiki o Mamotte. The English title is Please Save My Earth, created by Saki Hiwatari. In this manga, some characters find out that they are reincarnations of past lives and start to seek out other reincarnated characters via ads in a magazine. And apparently this manga actually caused some teenagers in real life to believe that they themselves were also reincarnated warriors, which in turn inspired them to also try and seek out supposedly reincarnated friends from their past lives through the use of magazine ads and pen pal columns. And the phrase, "In my past life I was a warrior," was used in a lot of these ads and pen pal columns. Sadly, this whole trend also led to some cases where teenagers got together and tried to regain their alleged past life memories by attempting to commit suicide. And these real-life events are essentially what Mika refers to in the game when she mentions the line, "In my past life I was a warrior," and says that she doesn't want to be part of something like that. On to another example. In various chapters you can call a journalist called Aramata, who is well versed in occultism and folklore. This character is probably based on Aramata Hiroshi, a writer, translator, professor, and more, who is known for his encyclopedic knowledge and has, among various other things, studied folklore and the occult. Calling Aramata and Twilight Syndrome, which you can do in several chapters, can even lead to fairly long and fascinating discourses on such topics. Here's an excerpt from such a scene.
We also call these particular stories that are spread throughout the city urban legends. One of the peculiar characteristics of these urban legends is how they are also linked to the mass media and commercialism. That creates a certain synergy where these tales of mysterious phenomena spread in a multiplying fashion. Records of such rumor-based stories can already be found among the oral tradition of the Meiji era when Japan's modernization had just begun. As an example, let's think of the time when trains were still run by steam locomotives. Some of the passengers riding these steam-powered trains would whisper rumors of ghost trains with such realism that it felt like they had witnessed these phenomena themselves. The same goes for the telephone when it was still a novelty. When the telephone was just a luxury item that only a handful of people were even connected to, numerous rumors of mysterious or paranormal phenomena related to the telephone were also going around. In other words, with the advance of modern times and technology, the mysteriousness that once had been confined to remote places like deep mountains or the bottom of the sea now also crept into said technology.
Next, let us briefly recall the concept of Gakko no Kaidan, or school kaidan, which we have talked about in a previous video. As mentioned before, this refers to kaidan that are somehow related to any kind of school setting and are often passed on as rumors by word of mouth, a concept which eventually led to a Japanese horror teledrama series called Gakko no Kaidan that aired in 1994 and was followed by various TV specials with a lot of prominent names from the world of Japanese horror cinema having worked on them. Now, in the interview with Suda Goichi, Suda actually brings up Gakko no Kaidan and mentions that the sound team behind the original Twilight Syndrome project wanted to create something similar to that, and this is another influence that can clearly be felt in the final product, because the game refers to its chapters not as chapters but as rumors, calling them Rumor 1, Rumor 2, Rumor 3, etc. And this is a typical element of Gakko no Kaidan, but also of Toshi Densetsu, Japanese urban legends, both of which were often spread or presented as rumors. Furthermore, almost every chapter in the first two games deals with high school student Kishi Mika picking up some paranormal rumor by word of mouth and persuading the other two characters to go investigate it with her. This frequently leads to sneaking into their school at night and exploring some part of it, which is also typical of school kaidan. Just think of the Honto ni atta Kawaii episode Natsu no Taiku-kan, for example. It should be noted though that the game also lets you explore various other locations, such as a park, a train station, the woods, or even an underground bunker. And a surreal realm between the world of the living and the dead. Still, a heavy focus on the school setting is definitely there, and was also picked up again by later entries in the Twilight Syndrome series, such as Twilight Syndrome Saikai, where the school grounds are the focus of almost every chapter. The release of the first two Twilight Syndrome games was eventually followed by Moonlight Syndrome in 1997, also for the PlayStation 1. Unlike the first two Twilight Syndrome games, where Suda Goichi only joined midway and made sure the game would somehow turn into a finished product, Moonlight Syndrome was completely in Suda Goichi's hands from the start, who gave it a new, much darker and more surreal direction. Unfortunately, Human Entertainment folded towards the end of the 1990s, but some of the people who worked on Twilight Syndrome went to Spike Company Limited, a company that would later merge into nowadays Spike Chunsoft, by the way. There, at Spike, they eventually developed a spiritual successor to Twilight Syndrome called Yuyamidori Tankentai, which could be translated as Twilight Street Exploration Crew. This game was released in 1999, again for the PlayStation 1. Then, in 2000, Spike actually released a new official Twilight Syndrome game called Twilight Syndrome Saikai, or Twilight Syndrome Reunion, again for PlayStation 1, and a fourth Twilight Syndrome game in 2008 for the Nintendo DS called Twilight Syndrome Kinjirareta Toshidensetsu, which translates to Twilight Syndrome The Forbidden Urban Legend. Twilight Syndrome Saikai introduced a new feature, by the way, where the player could use a camera to take photos during the exploration parts of each chapter. These photos would then be developed after the chapter was cleared, and depending on when and where you had taken a picture, you could actually see ghosts appear on them, which is a fitting development because spirit photography had been pretty popular for quite a while back then. Mechanics like this would soon reach a whole new level though with the spirit photography gameplay of the Project Zero games, also known as Zero or Fatal Frame, but these games will be discussed in another video soon enough. Finally, here's a little fun fact. Spike Chunsoft's crazy Japanese murder mystery visual novel adventure game Danganronpa, more specifically the second installment Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair, called Super Danganronpa 2 Sayonara Zetsubou Gakuen in Japanese, actually has a huge Twilight Syndrome reference in one of its cases, where you are forced to play a Twilight Syndrome clone called Twilight Syndrome Murder Case.
Ta-da! The name of the game is Twilight Syndrome Murder Case.
In conclusion, the Twilight Syndrome games, especially the first two, are great examples of Japanese horror works that directly reflect the era they were created in, as they fully embrace the paranormal trends of the Japanese 1970s, 80s and 90s, and feel like a love letter to Jitsu wa Kaidan, Toshidensetsu and Gakkou no Kaidan, with the later two Twilight Syndrome games basically following in their footsteps. And yet, the Twilight Syndrome games contain even more than just typical ghost sightings and hauntings. What made them stand out to me is that content-wise, they actually are very mature games. Sure, they also have their funny and lighthearted moments, but they also touch upon more sensitive topics that you normally didn't find all too often in video games back then, especially when the first two were released. These include topics like psychological and physical bullying in Japanese schools, as well as suicide as a result of this, forbidden relationships between teachers and their students, repressed homosexuality, a teenager experiencing the divorce of their own parents, and more. Now, if all of this made you think, man, that sounds quite interesting, if only there was a way to experience these Twilight Syndrome games, even though they were never released outside Japan, then I have just the thing for you, because I actually uploaded playthroughs of the first 3 Twilight Syndrome games with English subtitles on my channel. I will link to the respective playlists in the video description for anyone who's interested. And this concludes the video on Twilight Syndrome. In the next one, we will take a look at one of the most influential Japanese horror game series, namely Resident Evil. I hope to see you there, and as always, take care and goodbye.